Should we start then? My name is Carlos Affonso. I am from Brazil, not to be confused with Carlos Affonso Jr. And I am Brazilian Canadian during the Brazilian dictatorship and the Chilean dictatorship. I ended up in Canada as a political refugee. I lived here for almost 7 years in Toronto. And I am very grateful to this country, which gave me many opportunities during this political refuge, and including the Canadian citizenship. I would like to note that this conference has, besides CGI.br and .org, has also a good support from the APC. That's why I'm worried that Joy joins us. And I would like to start with a story, which is the story of Oi, which is not the story of Oi, the story of Oi. Oi is a Brazilian, was a Brazilian telephone company, which was bought by Portugal Telecom, so it's no longer a Brazilian company, it's a multinational. And the name Oi is a short name, sort of, I won't say imitated, but following on the steps of Telefonica, which has O2 in Europe. And so this company is called Oi. It's one of the 4 large multinationals. And there is a recent declaration. I don't know if you know, but we are in a process in Brazil of trying to approve what we call the rights framework of the Internet. And this began in 2008 with an effort by the CGI.br to create the 10 principles. 10 principles of use and 10 principles for the Internet in Brazil. And these principles mention net neutrality, accountability of intermediaries, and several other rights. The approach was an approach, of course, of rights. And the set of 10 principles was one of the bases of a proposal which is now in Congress in Brazil of having the civil rights framework as a sort of constitution of the Internet in Brazil, to serve as a reference for any law or regulation which relates or affects the Internet in the country. And this has been heavily bombarded by the telcos, and that's why I want to tell you very quickly the story of Oi, I say. And so this president, the CEO of Oi, went to the press 3 days ago. The setting is all this discussion going on in WCIT, the discussion on the elaboration of the new ITRs in the ITU, sorry for the initials, the International Telecommunication Regulations. And what he said was simply, we telcos, which run the main backbones in Brazil, have no right whatsoever to change, to block, to modify any of the traffic, while the content providers have all the rights to do so. We want the same rights. So it's very strange, because he wants to warranty that the telco, which provides connectivity, has the right to block, to sniff the packets, to change the packets, etc., at will, arbitrarily. And he was very blunt on that, and was, of course, motivation for a lot of protests in Brazil. Unfortunately, we have in Brazil the problem that the government is not clear about supporting or not all the civil framework, civil rights framework articles, including net neutrality and including the accountability of intermediaries. So Why I am bringing this topic? Because in this contest, the phone companies are vying for a lot of power regarding the internet and interfering in your rights in several ways, not only in net neutrality, but many other aspects of the internet. And this, of course, affects us all at the edges, which is where we live. We don't live in these conferences. We don't live in the cabinets of the ministers. We live in our homes, and this affects us all. So I would like to put this as a sort of setting for us to discuss rights here and remind us all that the Brazilian Steering Committee is a sort of, I wouldn't say mini because Hartmut Glaser is here, he would be very upset with me, but it's a sort of national reproduction of what ICANN tries to do regarding names and numbers. And we were bold enough, and why I say that is because we are a multi-stakeholder organization, and to manage to build a set of principles by consensus, including the representative of the telco was there at the time. It took us 2 years to do that. And my opening would then be why ICANN does not try to do a similar effort, to have a set of principles, rights approach principles, for its within its purview, what it does, what it supervises, what its oversight is, and so on. And so there are several suggestions here that I received from some people regarding what I should ask. And there is a question for all the panelists, which is, why are human rights a more critical issue now for NCUC and ICANN? I don't think this is proper. For NCUC, I think the rights approach is at the very beginning of the organization of the constituency. But of course, now we are doing a stronger effort to bring this issue into ICANN. And so ask panelists to refer to at least one example or one reason why they think human rights needs to be brought into ICANN policy development process. So I would like to open with this question and follow the order I have here in the program and ask Avri Doria to start. Thank you.
Thank you. So I get to go first. Okay. I'm going to start also somewhat with a little story, though mine's more personally anecdotal. When I first came to ICANN, I found out that people talk about a topic called the rights of others. I was really very excited when I heard that. I said, wow, I'm in an organization that cares about people's rights. And then I started talking to people and found out that rights of others was only about property rights. And that was the only rights that this organization seemed to have any notion of. So there was an NCUC meeting many, many years ago where Rebecca McKinnon came and said, you really ought to do a human rights impact analysis on every new policy that comes out. And the NCUC meeting at the time, we all nodded our head and said, yeah, that's a really good idea. We should do that. And for one thing, I've been personally working on it ever since. But human is a scary word in ICANN. We can do rights, because then you might understand it to only be property rights. But as soon as we say human rights, it opens up all kinds of scary, confusing topics about what people might mean, what they might ask for, what they might say they need. And in fact, we just went through a rejigging of a reforming of the GNSO's policy development process. And after probably a year of arguing for human rights, I eventually lost. And we now have a rights impact analysis, but not a human rights impact analysis. But of course, that's partially okay, because all of those are supposed to be reviewed by us. So that means NCUC can do a review of the rights impact analysis in any document that comes along and actually apply human rights as the impact, as the rights that we're checking on the impact of. Very awkward sentence. I apologize. So one of the places that we've been looking at it lately is the whole lovely topic of who is. And once again, we are back to starting new policy development processes on who is. The GNSO, possibly this week, will actually be reviewing a new policy development process for who is. And this is after a moratorium of several years. Now, one human right other than property, and it is important to remember that property is one of the human rights, and whenever somebody who's property rights oriented might want to say, well, you know, that may be somewhat a right too, is been recognized as privacy. So we're starting to accept the notion of privacy. We noticed in Prague that we even got to the point where the GAC was talking about privacy rights. And that was probably a moment of elation like I haven't had at ICANN, to hear that concern starting to come out from the board and from the GAC. But that's only a start. When we were talking about the who is, and I was complaining that, but we're not talking about rights here. So we have privacy. And so, well, what about freedom of expression? You know, what about the fact that privacy only relates to an individual and it doesn't relate to groups where you're dealing with a freedom of association and belonging to that group might be risky. Having that group be known and trackable might be risky in many of the countries that are still, you know, largely repressive. How can we require that? Have we done an analysis on all of the various rights, both to individuals, both to natural persons, and to groups of individuals? And that's a place that we just haven't reached yet. So I think it's a place, though, where sort of the NCUC has to take a leading role in every time we see, because we do have the hook now. Every PDP that comes up needs to, in the staff paper that precedes it, needs to have a rights impact analysis. That has been approved by the GNSO and by the board. So the hook is there. It's up to us now to make sure that we look and we start looking through more than just who is. Who is an obvious case. There may be other cases that, you know, I haven't been steeped in. We just haven't done the analysis. We have not subjected every one of the policy development processes that we engage in to this human rights impact, and it's time that we start doing it. Thanks.
Okay, yes, and the next one is Joy. Joy, are you online?
Yes, I am.
Great. Joy. There is, in the context that Avri was speaking, there is recently an NCUC statement about some human rights principles presented to ICANN, and I would like you to comment on that.
Sure, thank you, and also greetings everyone from New Zealand and from APC. A couple of things. Firstly, I think in answer to your question, Carlos, why does ICANN need to focus on human rights? I think one answer is that it makes public policy. And if it's making public policy, then it's about our human rights, and that policy must be human rights compliant. And I think NCUC has taken a step forward, the point that Avri was talking about, by saying, well, we need to develop some principles around which we can frame our analysis of rights impact. And we brought those together on our, on our list and in our constituency discussions, and some of those we agreed on some areas and disagreed on others. But we then used them in our new GTLD public comment to say that, we think in respect of particular applications and also in general, ICANN must be taking into account human rights impact. And let's face it, there are some governments and courts in the world that have clearly stated that there are legal guarantees for domain names, that they are not only technical internet resources. People use them to receive and impart information and ideas or to associate with each other. And for that reason, the very heart of our internet protocols and public policy around them squarely fit around protecting fundamental freedoms and human rights. And in addition to WHOIS, there's a whole range of ways in which ICANN public policy is touching on these things. Having said that, I think we also need to be cautious because ICANN is not a human rights it's not a human rights standards making body. It doesn't decide what our human rights are, and nor should it. So we need to be careful about how we bring human rights into discussions. And I think NCUC has played a particular role, as far as I can see anyway, in bringing these issues into ICANN. And we should do that mindful that we don't agree on all aspects of them. And finally, I'd just say that, we talked in the last panel, which I thought was an excellent one on internet governance in ICANN and what the negotiations are happening in relation to the ITR regulations. Well, that's a government body, and governments have human rights implications. And if we want to be holding governments to account in other forums for our internet rights and freedoms, then ICANN's really got no choice but to embrace this rights discussion and to become, a meaningful and constructive contributor to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Our next commentator is Desiree Miloshevic.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm Desiree Miloshevic, Senior Policy Advisor at Afilias. So I also am a member of NCUC in my personal capacity, and I remember, since you mentioned it this morning at least, the NCUC, or then the NCC meeting in 1999 at the University of Chile in Santiago looked much different than today's NCUC meeting. We were scrambling in a schoolroom and with some members that now cannot still get funding to come to an ICANN meeting, so like Norbert Klein and so on. So I would say that issues and the settings are different. ICANN was poor, but now some issues still remain. I'd like to maybe just try and answer your questions. How do human rights fit into the ICANN agenda? And especially then give a perspective from Afilias as a registry provider that runs has 22 million domain names under management. And what does it mean to have a role in running some parts of the infrastructure, as well as have the responsibility for some of the infrastructure that we deploy today and how that overall fits. I believe that the problem that we're trying to solve with the human rights issue is substantive and normative-driven issues, which are different from the technical operation issues. And although Afilias is an intermediary connecting people to their data, I'm also aware that some technical decision-making, such as infrastructure decisions, are consciously made and violate some human rights today. So first of all, I'd like to make that separation between the political issues and the technical operation issues, and to say that although infrastructure decisions are used to violate human rights, that is also fundamental a violation of the common standards. So I think it's important to make that decision. What Afilias has done is join the Global Network Initiative, which is a body that deals with human rights and in advancement of user rights to improve their freedom of expression and privacy. And I don't know how many people in the audience are familiar with principles of Global Network Initiative, but they have some core principles that I believe are missing in the ICANN mission that was of core principles that was last revised in 2003. And I'm very glad to hear from Avri that now there are some hooks in the GNSO that could also have some of the policy development processes developed within ICANN be checked against basic human rights. One would take it for granted that nation states, like the institutions, like ICANN, would adhere to some of the articles or to all the UN Declaration of Human Rights, especially the Article 19. And I'm also very pleased to hear that Article 29 is participating in the policy making of ICANN. So what needs to be done, I think, is in terms of answering that question, how to fit in human rights in ICANN, is there are two questions. One is certainly the question of participation, how to get more government bodies as well as civil societies that do work on human rights involved in the ICANN policy development process. And I think that's not an easy answer, but that is certainly that, at least I feel, should happen. Secondly, in addition to participation, how to get more participation, is that I think although ICANN job is to manage technical coordination of the domain name system, people have the illusion that the technical problems are independent of politics and policies, and the domain name system has this public-facing feature where it interacts with all the policy issues. So I think that therefore it is an important issue to address. I will stop here and also mention, just if we were to look at some of the ICANN constituency advisory committees, it's worth mentioning that, for example, the Government Advisory Committee has in their draft in Dakar 2011, in their core operating principles, they have included things in a preamble, not in the very articles, of recognizing free expression. So I think we all as a community have a task to go back and see who is already recognizing these operating principles and whether ICANN as an institution needs to join GNI or whether all the others have to come to ICANN. Thank you.
Thank you, Desiree. Yes, it goes rights, and ICANN goes far beyond trademarks, rights holders, intellectual property rights. And I would like now to ask a question to Stefania. And I have something written here for Stefania. Many people in ICANN communities really can't understand how human rights generally might relate to ICANN's public policy role. Can you talk about the recent Italian experience with developing an internet-related Bill of Rights and how this might be relevant to ICANN public policy?
So my name is Stefania, and the reason why I introduced myself again is that I'm new to this context. I'm new to the ICANN.
By the way, I'm not introducing anybody because, one, many people already know the people that are here, and second, the introduction is in this paper distributed to all. So, okay, sorry.
So I just wanted to apologize on behalf of this panel for anyone who's having a MacBook and talking about human rights. We should at least be aware of that.
Well, anyway, I want to introduce myself just to explain that I'm new here, so beg your pardon if in advance if I'm going to say something which doesn't really fit into this, because I'm learning a lot. Thank you, Brandon, for inviting me to join you. I'm actually also a newcomer to the government delegation of my country, Italy, so for me this is all an entirely new experience. So please read everything I'm going to say in that framework. Okay, so Italy, yes, we are working on a sort of Bill of Rights of the Internet, except that we don't use the word rights anywhere. How did this thing start? As you might know, since 2011, we have a technocratic government which took over from Berlusconi. I was invited as part of this renewed effort to introduce some reforms to my country to join the Minister of Education, University and Research as an expert on innovation policies and new media. And my group at some point was tasked with developing a document on, quote unquote, the fundamental principles of the Internet. I took it on board and I drafted it. I tried to include a number of experts, people, civil society experts, what we call citizen experts. Not necessarily academic, not necessarily people who have, lawyers who have specific reason, work-related reason to be expert on something, but people who are actually engaged in changing things or doing things on the ground. For example, open access, open data, people working on issues of inclusion, accessibility as they apply to the internet and so on. We developed this document. I can provide you with a rough overview if you want. It has 5 sections and 22 points. Unfortunately, we don't have yet an English translation, but it will be ready next week. And I'm happy to send it to anyone who is interested, especially if you are able to suggest how to improve it. In short, the 5 themes are, well, this general introduction that we call general principles of the Internet. There are some principles on digital citizenship. Third is users and consumers of the net, production and circulation of contents online, and security. Now, we need to go through the text to give you some more detailed information. Well, it opens saying that the Internet is not a human right, but is a global common good. And it is an instrument for the development and exercise of human rights. So we just take a different approach, and we take an approach that I would define of practices. So instead of starting from precise documents like our Constitution or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we decided to start from the language and the practices on the ground of the people who use the Internet, build the Internet, and participate online. There is also another reason for that. This is going to be adopted by the government eventually, hopefully. And for this, I hope to have some help from you, because international pressure is very much needed. We are running out of time. There's going to be elections, so we have to make sure that this process is over by next spring, so that we can bring home something that we might be able to use for other things. I lost what I was trying to say. So anyway, we wanted to speak to the people mostly, make a text that people would understand, and a text that people would engage with. We open it for consultation. It's currently online. We adopted a specific way of consulting our citizens, which is a platform software called IdeaScale. It's a proprietary software. We ran out of time. We didn't have much time to explore different possibilities. People can go online, submit their ideas, read the text, and engage with it. Vote. This is not very, very nice, but it gives an indication how people engage, even if it's not on the basis of vote or likes that you're going to make any policy, of course. And people can also suggest concrete actions. It's difficult to get people to actually engage on principles. They prefer to engage at the level of practices, as I said, but then the effort is to make them translate their practices into principle. So I have much more to tell you, but let's try to, bring back the discourse to the issue of human rights. As I said, I'm a newcomer, and when I saw the topic and the questions, I was a bit puzzled, and I was like, well, my reaction was, it's obvious that you refer to human rights. Are you still discussing this? At the same time, I come from an activist background. And I spent my last 8 years as an academic trying to approach and study and investigate radical internet activists, hackers, all these bad guys that usually don't come to ICANN. And if they could have, if not destroy it, but try to create some problems, technical problems mostly. I can tell you that, adopting a kind of provocative approach to the language of human rights, the language of rights for these groups can be alienating. For many grassroots groups, is alienating. Doesn't mean much. Human rights have been there for a long time. They are very little respected, unfortunately. So some of the people I work with, said, well, it didn't work so far. Why would you expect they would work if applied to the internet? So that's one thing. The other thing is that starting on practices allows you to bring in more and more citizens who usually engage in protest by doing or governance by doing. They don't really engage with ICANN, they don't engage with the IGF, they don't understand the process, they have no time, they have no resources. If they don't like something, they just act against it. If I don't like copyright, I download music. Very basic, stupid example. Then from the perspective of the government, and it's funny that I speak for the government because I come from a completely different perspective, but it makes very little sense to speak of rights, like say the internet is a human right if you're not able to provide most of the Italian citizens with a proper broadband connection. So if I don't have the tools, it's wishful thinking to speak about rights. Of course, all the issues of civil liberties, of rights, right to privacy, right to secrecy of correspondence, and so on, which are also enshrined in our constitution, are the underlying reference, even if they're not included specifically on the Bill of Rights. In fact, in Italy, we don't call it Bill of Rights. And to conclude, yeah, in a way, it's an exercise of adapting the language to practice. The internet challenges us because, well, human rights, the kind, in a way, according to some of the activists, would be slightly outdated. They're the only tool we have. They're very important. Nonetheless, perhaps we have to exercise some creativity and some fantasy and looking forward to see how we can adapt our language to the practice, how we can come up with new, like a right to open data or something like that. So looking what exists on the ground and think in legislation in terms of practices. 2 cents.
Thank you, Stefania. Our next speaker is Magaly Pazello. And besides what is written here, Magaly is a long-time militant of the cause of human rights and gender equality and so on. And she has been also a research member of our institute, Instituto NUPEF in Brazil. And I remember Magaly certainly will have comments on something that I would like to remind you, that during the WC's process, the WSIS, the concepts of internet governance emerged. And also there was a very, very systematic and proactive work done by a group of NGOs, international and internationally, called the CRIS, the Communication Rights in the Information Society. And this was a proactive, I would say, movement or process in which there was a lot of accumulation on the discussion and the concepts of how human rights relate or apply to or have to be enhanced or preserved in an information society. And I think it would be very important if we could try to rescue all the richness of this process. Because, human rights is an issue of permanent, very long time. There was no big change since then. Probably the issues that were discussed then are the ones that we have to discuss today. And all that accumulation, we should take advantage of that accumulation. And I know that Magaly participated in that process, so I would like her to comment on that too. Please, Magaly. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlos. It is interesting when you talk about the CRIS campaign, because, the CRIS campaign, the principles, or how can I say, the rationale of the CRIS campaign, the basis of the CRIS campaign. The CRIS was based on this historical process on peace and human rights that started in the 70s. So it is interesting because since the 70s, all the idea of communication and human rights and the right of the communications as a human right, and how this play a relevant and crucial role for peace in the world and human rights was missed during the 30 years by different regions, by the relation of the nations, the global process. So when the Chris campaign came up, what we faced, and we was challenged by that, was what we faced, back to the struggle we have faced is the countries that stand against stand up against all the language the Chris campaign was bringing up again, was the same countries that have make the opposition of the one voice, one word, one voice book, no? The Magaly Inform in the 70s was the same country. So it is interesting because we are changed. The world has changed. Many things have happened, but you have, in terms of human rights, we have a long process that time by time it's more like I say the process is more slow. The achievements we meet is sometimes you need to how to say it? You need to review and reconstruct and agree again. So I think the Chris campaign is a very good example. Indeed, I was not so involved too much in the Chris campaign, the global movement. I was more involved at the Brazil level. But it's remarkable how the Chris campaign bring up all this historical process, the language used by the Chris campaign, the review of the language used in the 70s, and how we are facing the same problems again and again and again. So I think the new international institutions or new international organizations or political arenas where communication, now ICTs or in specific internet, is the main theme or is the region of the existence of those organizations. It's interesting to see how this language and this process in this field is still a challenge for us. So, I don't know how to say more.
Okay, I would like very much to have comments from the audience, but I would like to do to give the opportunity of the speakers to make additional comments, beginning with Avri.
Thanks. Really just two quick ones. One is in terms of the idea of developing new sets of principles. I think at the moment we've got so many sets of principles that we really, I think it's good to do, but I think we have to start getting people to actually accept them and subscribe to them. And certainly coming back to the notion of ICANN, whether it's the G&I, which I think is a great idea, or some other set of principles, I would hate to see ICANN try to develop a set. I would be really happy to see them say they accepted human rights principles as defined in documents, the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, et cetera, economic and social and cultural rights, and have them accept it, or accept any other set of principles. But I really don't think that we want to get ICANN into trying to develop rights. I think it's enough if they lived up to them.
Yes, thank you, Carlos. I think in trying to answer your question why you think that human rights are now more important issue for NCUC and ICANN than they were before, and we try to say they always were an important issue, but I think more and more with the governments trying to get more control, with corporate organization having a lot of data and information that touches upon privacy and so on. The issue is that we may not need any new rights, perhaps new Bill of Rights, but we need to enforce the existing rights. And the Internet is showing us every day on every front how fragile they are when the new technologies and new economic models are introduced. So I think that's what's going on. And secondly, to Avri points, where do you fit it in within ICANN? Does it need to fit in? Or does ICANN need to subscribe to a set of principles like the GNI's principles? It would be nice to have this check of each of the advisory committee and each of the stakeholder group thinking and making a statement how they feel. And because we know that in Article 19, I think that would be the simplest one to start off, that the Article 19 of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, it says this right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. I think this is something that speaks to domain name, TLDs and so on.
Yeah, just a quick comment on engagement, because, it goes a little bit outside of what we're discussing here, but it was discussed earlier. And one of the reasons why the CRIS campaign, for example, didn't work in Italy, I was part of it, was that precisely because we use the language of rights. And now, don't get me wrong, I'm not against human rights, and I'm totally in favor to have them as guiding stars of the policies of ICANN. At the same time, I want to defend the practice of engaging the citizenship and giving the citizens the chance to elaborate on their practices and what they think it is right for them and for their country to do. So, I agree. There's plenty of wonderful Bill of Rights, of Charter of Principles, of Human Rights Declaration, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, it's not all of them, most of the principles are not being implemented. Perhaps one of the reasons is precisely that people don't ask for it. So if you give them the chance to reflect on what they do and become the owners of the process, perhaps they're going to make some pressure for it, advocate for it, ask for it. And in this sense, as a process of empowerment, of understanding digital citizenship, we're working with the schools. We're trying to engage people using different tools for engagement, even if, different tools for public consultation, and so on, that ideally might form the kids who are now in school these days, who are perhaps 15 and use the internet. And it might be the future users and participants in the non-commercial user constituency.
Well, I would like to remark 2 things, 2 points for this, to open to the audience to comment. One thing is, in terms of human rights in the global level, what has happened now, for example? What is happening in the most arenas where human rights is a main issue? For example, in the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, or other arenas, is more and more what I am observing, or I have, and also I'm following up, is that internet and human rights as a binomial, or it's like binary, not binomial. well, more internet and human rights as these two concepts or these two words is going together. Now it's more and have been under analysis of this, or is more and more an issue in these different arenas. Also, you saw this last year and in 2010 in the UN Security Council. This year more strongly we see this in the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, at the regional level. For example, in Latin America, it's more and more people are talking about internet and human rights. It's not internet rights, but internet and human rights. Something has happened. Why there is this changing in terms of language, in terms of the preoccupations of governments and civil society and human rights, especially the human rights international organizations. I think that there are something happened, and it is something you have to keep an eye. Also because ICANN is an international organization, or would be, or should be, or wish to be. And I think we need to keep an eye on that. The second thing is, in terms of the Latin America region, I'm talking about my region. Human rights this year in the meeting, the IGF, every year Latin America organize a regional meeting on IGF. So this year, human rights was a cross-cutting issue. So in all the panels, all the things was this was very present. People bring up this in a very diverse, in a very different way. So I think this is not, when you talk about human rights, it's not something we are bringing from the past, it's something we are looking at from the future, and the present and the future, because something is happening in this context.
Thank you, Magaly. I would like to open for your comments, questions.
Joy.
Oh, I forgot Joy. I'm sorry, Joy. Joy, are you still online?
Of course.
I'm sorry.
It's all right. Out of sight, out of mind.
Incredible. Please, Joy, the floor is yours, virtually.
If I may, just look, a couple of very brief comments. One is, I wanted to pick up a point that Fadi Shahad made earlier in his presentation when he talked about the need to balance competing claims and competing interests. And I think this is equally true in the field of human rights, because we can all send down the catwalk a whole variety of rights that we all have. The question is not, are there rights? A key question in ICANN public policy is how to balance competing or conflicting rights. And I think that's where the NCUC developing principles is really important, because what we've articulated is, when in doubt, human rights should prevail, not particular commercial interests, not particular political interests, but we should revert to our rights and freedoms as the touchstone for decisions. And I really wanted to pick up a comment that Stefania made in preparing for the panel. She talked about policy hacking, this idea, I elaborate on Stefania, of basically hacking policy in a way to ensure it goes forward in the ways that we actively want to see. And I think that this connects with Magaly's comment about something's happening around the internet and human rights in other places, in the Human Rights Council, at the activism level, and we really need to pay attention and think creatively. How can we use this in ICANN public policy in ways to creatively hack, if you like, and make sure that ICANN public policy outputs do affirm and uphold our rights and freedoms, excuse me, in new and sort of innovative ways. Thanks.
Thank you, Joy. I'm sorry. Now we have comments from you, please.
Kathy Kleiman, thank you for
Kathy,
a wonderful
please
panel.
go ahead.
And Joy, in some ways, may have anticipated or talked to my question. So, Joy, know that I was up at the microphone before you responded. It's interesting to listen. In the early days of NCUC, we actually reached out to human rights groups. I reached out to the ACLU, among others. And there were so many other issues outside of ICANN that it just wasn't very interesting to people. So I wanted to share some good news, actually, that issues like freedom of expression, free speech, fair use, and privacy have been on the ICANN agenda. We've put them there. NCUC has put them there since the beginning. Carlos and Hartmut and Milton and Desiree and I, and please forgive me for anyone I didn't mention, that goes back to '99, when we argued this with the very first UDRP, and we said it's not fair and it's not balanced. I want to let you know there's another language out there. In addition to the human rights language, there's also the openness of communications, and some of us come to this from the communications world. I used to be a telecom attorney before the PETA domain name case crossed my desk and changed my life in '96. So what we're coming from, so the language is a little different, and we need to talk about that a little bit. But we're coming, those of us who come from the communication sphere, we don't care what the content is, as long as it's not illegal, I guess. But we don't care what the content is. The idea is that it's open, and that anyone can put anything out there. And whenever we see restrictive rules in the DNS, we try to keep it open rather than closed. So it's a slightly different language than the human rights language. But it is free speech, fair use, balance. Let me pose a question to you guys. As I understand it, ICANN has a fairly narrow mandate. And I always thought that we should urge it to stay out of content and stay within fairly narrow constraints. I understand we overlap a little into content, but I'm hearing kind of broad issues of internet, content, and human rights. Are we talking within the scope of ICANN, or are we talking something in addition?
Question is whose? We want to
when I look at it, first of all, I've never believed that ICANN was as narrow as some of the we need to keep it narrow people argue. I think that whether it was when I was an engineer working on protocols, and we would say, gee, it's just a protocol for moving packets around. Why worry about rights? And then all of a sudden finding out that I put something that allowed for traceability of anyone, anywhere into that protocol. It's just at that point you have a realization that sort of says it really doesn't matter what you think you're doing. If the fact of what you're doing has an impact on the rights, you need to understand it, you need to explore it. So I think that, yes, at its base, we just do names and numbers. And in fact, those numbers are really just funny digital names. But the fact is that the way those things are distributed, the way they're used, the way they're constrained, the way they're governed, touches a much larger number of issues, a much broader. And I think that if we're going to say that we're responsible for governing these things, then we have to deal with those implications. We have to understand them. Does it go so far as content? One of the arguments that we keep having over new GTLDs and such is what's in a name. Does a name have meaning? Does a name have content separate from the content somebody may attach to that name someday? In making decisions, in making any of these decisions, we are making decisions that have implications on all of those rights. Certainly within the who is world. We're constantly making decisions that affect the freedom of association of people, the freedom of expression of people, and their privacy. And we can't say, it's just technical stuff. Because I know that I put in a protocol. I was really embarrassed. I read an RFC I wrote. And I had put in some notion of traceability. It's really important for the technical purposes to understand who's using what when. And I hadn't been thinking about this stuff then. And all of a sudden I was reviewing it and totally embarrassed. But I was just dealing with a network working well. And so even if we think it is just names and numbers, it's not.
Thank you, Avri. Please, go ahead.
I'm Didi Alec. Just to give a little bit of background, what I think was being referenced is and Chris really grew out of the work of the NUWICO, the New World Information Order, which happened towards which was a commission by UNESCO to look at democracy and communication. And the book, which is called Many Voices, One World, which is Sean McBride, who was the founder of Amnesty International. So it sort of that also brings together both human rights and communication, that he basically, after founding Amnesty, felt that you couldn't stop with human rights, you had to deal with communication also, and urged the UNESCO to form the commission that wrote this report, which is very hard to get now because the UN, under great pressure from the United States, took the book out of publication, and but then it was just recently republished, and it's also on the web, and well worth looking at in terms of making these kinds of I love the term policy hacking, but it is a very good a starting point for really trying to express what human rights are in terms of communication. And then the other thing, which Chris and a number of us in Geneva, and I was working around the communication, community media part of it, the Civil Society Declaration, which was written in the first WSIS in Geneva, is available on the web, and really is an excellent document. It's like the Declaration of Human Rights for communication, and it's very useful. I've given it to students who really are amazed by it and like it. It's very comprehensive and quite well worth looking at. So maybe we could put the URL for that up on the web.
Thank you, Didi. Bertrand?
Actually, I'm very happy that the other rights, in parallel to freedom of expression, are getting slowly in the discussion and the debate. Right of association, right of assembly, and right of circulation are those that come to mind. And in the last one, I want to highlight one issue that is emerging. You may have noticed that recently there are regulations that are popping up in various countries regarding virtual private networks, VPNs. There is a real debate about cyber travel. To take an analogy, if you are in whatever country, I won't name any, you're alone, I'm a French citizen, I'm alone in my hotel room in country X. I connect through my VPN to my own server in my basement to things that are perfectly legal in my country. Where am I? Am I in that country subject to that jurisdiction? Only if I download, if I use a cloud, that sort of thing? These are issues that are emerging that are not necessarily directly connected to the daily work of ICANN. However, as I said in one of the previous discussions, I see progressively the domain name system, among other things, as being a map of the jurisdictions. And when you're moving from one domain name in .com to a website in .cn, even if you're not aware of it, you are crossing a virtual frontiers in terms of jurisdiction. And so some of the platforms, for instance, are now exploring the possibility of making a default access through a CCTLD registration that could be, quote-unquote, filtered according to the national law, but however request that users can switch their setting to another location. So you would have an IP geolocation that would set the default, but you should be able or allowed from the same place to say, oh, actually, no, I'm switching. There are even countries that encourage that sort of thing so that VPNs are available to access information broadly. And on the other hand, some are regulating VPNs to prevent this. This topic of cyber travel is something that needs to be taken into account, because you can use VPN just like anonymizers in very bad ways, but you can use them also in very good ways to enable the spread of rights. And finally, the topic of the proliferation of declarations of rights is troublesome in a way because they're proliferating, but it's clearly indicating a trend, as I said. And I want to pay tribute here to the Coalition on Internet Rights and Principles in the IGF, because I was among the people who very early on were very interested in the activity, but were afraid that launching this would be reopening the can of worms of the existing declarations and making the standard actually ultimately lower. And people who were in the coalition or were very concerned didn't bother about this argument, and they said, we will prod along because we believe it is time to discuss those things. And they found a very interesting balance, saying part one is reaffirmation of the existing rights, and second is fine-tuning and appropriation and adaptation to the digital age. And the reason why I say it's good is because this could only happen in the IGF. If it had been in any intergovernmental organization, very well-intentioned governmental representatives like myself would have said, because we fear it's going in the wrong direction, we don't want to open the discussion because that's not the right tool. In the IGF, people took the initiative, they proved it was okay, and that's a better way to set the agenda. It's a more open and bottom-up manner. So I hope the IGF in Baku will allow to clearly discuss how to make those declarations converge, be structured, and maybe in UNESCO in February as a way to discuss that further.
Thank you, Bertrand. Joy, do you want to respond?
Please, I don't mind. This order. Bertrand, thank you for that. I think one of the exciting things that we'll continue to see, is new ways in which we give meaning to our rights and freedoms in new forms of violations. And I think we need to be human rights ready. We need to be capable and able to understand the implications. And I really hope that the ICANN board will respond to the invitation to come to the NCUC workshop in the ICANN on ICANN and human rights, which I think would be an excellent follow-up to some of the discussions today. Kathy, I just wanted to say thank you for raising this point. When I first came to ICANN about 3 years ago, CCTLD pathway, I was actually quite astounded at how many human rights issues there were, and extremely impressed with the NCUC group that seems very steeped in knowledge and history about the human rights implications of ICANN policy. And I think thank goodness that over the years this constituency and others have protected them. And I think that it would be fair to say mainstream are some way behind understanding the human rights that live and breathe in ICANN. And that we've got more work to do, I think, in bringing them in and connecting some of these human rights organisations across the language barriers they might face. And what they talk about, there are some underlying values. So that's one. I think also that in relation to ICANN's narrow mandate on human rights, it's true that we don't expect ICANN to deliver world peace. although that would be nice. But we do expect within the ambit the full range of rights to be taken into. So that was just what I wanted to respond.
Thank you, Joy. Okay, there seem to be no more comments. I would like to... Oh, there is one. Sorry.
Hi. My name's Chris Lahat. I'm the ICANN Ombudsman. Now, Ombudsmen traditionally, in their function as classical ombudsmen, have a role in human rights. And I think in a great deal of this discussion, we've forgotten that somehow within ICANN, we have someone whose job it is to look at issues of fairness. Now, fairness is an interesting word, but it does encompass an inquiry from time to time into some of these issues that we've just spent quite a lot of very thoughtful discussion upon. And I think it's worth reminding people that where there are issues within the ICANN community of fairness, then the Ombudsman is not just here to deal with perhaps some of the more mundane issues, but perhaps also there is from time to time some bigger picture issues. And to some extent what I'm saying is that the door is open, and if people are concerned that these are not being addressed and that there are some substantial issues of fairness up there in the ICANN community, then knock on my door.
Thank you very much. Any other comments? Okay, I would like to ask the panel if they have any additional comments. I'll make a comment. I remind an old friend, Tom Jenkins. Tom Jenkins is the CEO of OpenText here in Canada. It's a company that provides knowledge management systems to large companies. And he knows a lot about intranets and things like that. And he says, well, first of all, he says that as of July 2012, there were 4.2 billion toothbrushes in the world and 5.1 billion cell phones. And he says something that makes us think, besides, of course, thinking of toothbrushes and cell phones, that the Internet today has a public part which holds about 20 to 30 billion pages, which are the pages that are or can be indexed and you can reach through Google or any other search system. And many trillions of pages which are in the hidden web, intranets, private, corporate, private, government, etc. And many other systems which are behind firewalls. And he asks the question, of course, what are the issues and what can be done in this hidden web, and which the many good things are things that are done for business, for government, etc., and also cybercrime, violation of rights, and so on, which are out of reach of the public. So it's a good, interesting thing, because this, it says that 90% of the data today, which is quotation marks available on the internet, is in this hidden web, not in the public one. And I thank you. There is still another thing, is the engaging NCUC and ICANN policy development. Robin, please.